There are places in this world where the wood runs red, not with sap, but with something far more sinister. In the summer of 1884, deep in the Nevada wilderness, a family's desperate hunger would transform them into something that nightmares are made of. What started as survival became an appetite that could never be satisfied. The Henley family thought they understood hardship, thought they knew the meaning of sacrifice. They had no idea how wrong they were, or how far they would fall when winter came calling with empty bellies and impossible choices. Before we dive into the story, if you're enjoying these shocking tales from America's dark past, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's incredible story. Also, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. The sound of Willem Henley's saw cutting through pine had echoed across these Nevada mountains for 15 years, a steady rhythm that marked the passage of seasons and the slow accumulation of hope. But on this October morning in 1884, that familiar sound carried a note of desperation that made his wife Sarah pause at the cabin window, her weathered hands gripping the wooden frame until her knuckles went white. Willem wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped back from the timber he'd been shaping, his eyes scanning the horizon where autumn storm clouds gathered like vultures. At 43, his body still carried the strength of a man who'd built his life with his hands, but his face showed the strain of watching that life crumble around him. The mining company's representative had left 3 days ago with news that would haunt Willem's dreams. Their contract wouldn't be renewed. After 15 years of steady work, the Henley family sawmill was no longer needed. Inside the cabin, Sarah ladled watery soup into wooden bowls, stretching their meager supplies to feed 5 adults on what should have been enough for 3. Their twin sons, Jack and Samuel, sat at the rough-hewn table they'd built together when the boys were still learning to swing an axe. Now 25 years old, both men had the broad shoulders and calloused hands of born loggers, but their faces had grown hollow over the past month as work dried up and meals became smaller. Ruth, their youngest at 19, helped her mother serve the thin broth while humming a melody she'd learned from a traveling preacher years ago. Her voice had always been their bright spot during dark times, but even her songs couldn't chase away the shadow that had settled over their family. She caught her father's worried glance through the window and forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Willem entered the cabin and took his place at the head of the table, bowing his head for grace as he had every evening for 15 years. But tonight his prayer carried weight that made the words stick in his throat. Lord, we thank you for this meal and ask for your guidance in the days ahead. Help us find our way through this trial and keep our family strong. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as they finished their meager dinner, rain lashing against the cabin walls with unusual fury. Willem studied the faces of his family in the flickering candlelight, seeing his own fear reflected in their eyes. Winter was coming fast, and they had nowhere near enough supplies to last until spring. That night, as wind howled through the trees surrounding their mill, Willem made a decision that would change everything. He would go hunting at first light, storm or no storm. His family would not starve on his watch, no matter what it cost him. He had no way of knowing that the choice he was making would lead them all down a path from which there could be no return. Some hunts change a man forever, and some meat leaves a taste that can never be forgotten. 3 weeks had passed since Willem returned from that hunting trip, and something fundamental had shifted in the Henley household. The hollow cheeks that had marked each family member were filling out again, color returning to faces that had grown pale with hunger. Ruth hummed while she worked, her voice stronger than it had been in months. and the twins no longer moved with the careful economy of men preserving their strength for essential tasks only. Sarah noticed it first in herself, the way she woke each morning feeling truly rested instead of fighting the bone-deep exhaustion that comes with slow starvation. Her hands had stopped shaking when she poured coffee, and her mind felt sharp again, alert to the world around her in ways she'd forgotten were possible. But beneath the relief lay questions she wasn't ready to ask her husband, about the meat that had sustained them and the trips he'd been taking into the forest. The blizzard that arrived in early November came without warning, transforming their mountain home into an island of warmth surrounded by a frozen wasteland. Thomas Briggs appeared through the swirling snow like an apparition, his horse stumbling with exhaustion as he fought his way to their door. He was a prospector, he told them between chattering teeth, following rumors of new claims in the mountains beyond their mill. Willem welcomed the stranger with an enthusiasm that surprised even Sarah, ushering him inside and insisting he stay until the storm passed. Thomas was grateful for the hospitality, spreading his gear by their fire and sharing stories of successful claims he'd heard about from other prospectors. His pack was heavy with modest findings from his current expedition, enough gold dust to keep a man comfortable through winter if he was careful with his spending. As the wind howled outside, Thomas regaled them with tales from mining camps across Nevada, speaking of fortunes made and lost, of men who'd struck it rich overnight and others who died pursuing dreams that never materialized. Ruth listened with wide eyes, asking innocent questions about his travels and his plans, while Sarah prepared the best meal their remaining supplies would allow. But Willem found himself studying their guest with calculating eyes, noting the man's build, his equipment, the way he moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to solitude. Thomas was alone, that much was clear, with no family expecting his return and no clear destination beyond vague talk of claims that might or might not exist. He was exactly the kind of man who disappeared in these mountains without anyone asking too many questions. That night, as Thomas slept peacefully by their fire, Willem sat in the darkness listening to his family's steady breathing and feeling something new stirring in his chest. It wasn't the desperate hunger that had driven him 3 weeks ago, but something deeper and more troubling. The taste of that first kill still lingered in his memory, rich and satisfying in ways that game had never been. His family was strong again because of his choice, and looking at Thomas's sleeping form, Willem realized he was ready to make that choice again. Ruth stirred in her bed, and Willem caught her eyes reflecting the dying firelight. For a moment, father and daughter regarded each other in silence, and Willem saw something in her expression that both thrilled and terrified him. She understood what he was thinking, and more than that, she approved. Their transformation had begun during those hungry weeks, but it was accelerating now, spreading through the family like fever. The storm raged for 3 more days, keeping Thomas trapped with them while Willem refined his plans. Sarah began asking their guest careful questions about his route, whether anyone knew his exact destination, how long before people might expect to hear from him. The twins started discussing the practical aspects of winter travel, how easy it would be for a man to lose his way in weather like this, how many prospectors simply vanished without a trace each year. When Thomas finally woke on the 4th morning, he found the Henley family gathered around the breakfast table, watching him with smiles that somehow didn't reach their eyes. The storm had passed, but something else was beginning, something that would change them all forever. Willem rose to serve their guest one final meal, his hand steady as he carved portions with the same knife he'd been sharpening in the darkness. The taste was already on his tongue. Spring arrived in the Nevada mountains with promises of renewal, But the Henley family had already been reborn through the dark months of winter. Word had begun spreading through the scattered mining camps that the sawmill offered more than just lumber and repairs. Travelers spoke of warm meals, comfortable shelter, and a family whose generosity seemed to know no bounds. Willem had carefully cultivated this reputation, ensuring that just enough visitors survived their stay to carry tales of Henley hospitality to the next settlement. The mill itself had undergone subtle changes that only the family truly understood. Willem had modified the building's layout, creating hidden spaces where certain activities could be conducted away from prying eyes. The main saw, which had once only known the bite of pine and oak, had been adapted for purposes that would have horrified its original designers. Sarah had taken charge of provisioning, developing an elaborate system for preserving and storing meat that kept their larder well-stocked through even the leanest times. Ruth had discovered talents she never knew she possessed, an intuitive understanding of human nature that made her invaluable in identifying suitable targets. She could spot a lonely prospector's weakness from across a crowded trading post, could tell within minutes of conversation whether a traveler had family waiting for news of their journey. Her beauty had always attracted attention, but now she wielded it like a weapon, drawing men to their mill with promises of companionship and understanding. The twins had developed an almost supernatural coordination in their work, anticipating each other's movements with the precision of dancers performing a well-rehearsed routine. Jack would engage their guests in conversation while Samuel positioned himself for optimal advantage, or Samuel would create distractions while Jack secured escape routes. Their efficiency had improved dramatically over the winter months, each successful hunt teaching them new techniques and building their confidence. When Ezekiel Ward arrived on a warm May afternoon, riding a sturdy horse and carrying himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to authority, the family felt the first tremor of genuine concern they'd experienced since their transformation began. Ward claimed to be a traveling preacher, spreading God's word to remote settlements and mining camps, but his eyes held a sharpness that suggested experience with more worldly matters than scripture and salvation. He was older than their usual guests, perhaps 50 years of age, with graying hair and hands that showed the calluses of hard work rather than the soft palms of a man who lived by words alone. When Ruth attempted her usual subtle flirtation, Ward maintained polite but distant courtesy, acknowledging her beauty without being drawn into her web of carefully constructed intimacy. His prayers before meals seemed to last longer than necessary, as if he was asking for protection against specific threats rather than offering general gratitude. Willem found himself studying Ward with the same calculating attention he'd once given to Thomas Briggs. But this man presented complications their previous guests had not. Ward asked questions about the mill's history, about previous visitors, about the practical details of running a business in such an isolated location. His inquiries seemed casual enough, but there was an underlying purpose that made Willem's instincts prickle with warning. Sarah noticed that Ward examined everything with unusual thoroughness, his gaze lingering on stains in the mill that she thought they'd cleaned completely, on tools that had been repurposed for tasks their original makers never intended. He complimented her cooking with genuine appreciation, but she caught him studying the texture and flavor of their meat with the attention of a man who'd eaten many different types of protein in his lifetime. The twins found Ward impossible to read in the way they'd learned to assess other visitors. He engaged with their conversations but revealed little about himself, deflected personal questions with scripture quotations, and maintained awareness of his surroundings that suggested either military training or hard-won frontier wisdom. When Samuel attempted to maneuver him into a vulnerable position during a tour of the mill, Ward seemed to sense the intention and smoothly repositioned himself without making the avoidance obvious. As Ward's visit stretched into its second week, the family realized they faced their first real challenge since beginning their new way of life. This man was not another lonely prospector or desperate drifter who could disappear without causing ripples in the larger world. Ward had mentioned churches in 3 different settlements where he was expected, people who would ask questions if he failed to arrive on schedule. But more troubling than the practical complications was Ward's obvious intelligence and experience. He was studying them with the same predatory attention they'd learned to focus on their prey, asking questions that probed the foundations of their carefully constructed facade. The family began to understand that they weren't just hosting another potential victim, they were being hunted by someone who recognized what they'd become. 3 weeks into Ezekiel Ward's stay at the mill, the carefully maintained harmony of the Henley family began showing cracks that threatened to shatter their entire operation. Ward had settled into their routine with unsettling ease, rising before dawn to offer prayers that seemed to grow more pointed with each passing day, helping with mill work while asking questions that probed deeper than casual curiosity warranted. Ruth had attempted every technique in her arsenal to distract or seduce the preacher, but Ward maintained boundaries that frustrated her beyond measure. She would brush against him while serving meals, engage him in conversations about loneliness and companionship, even suggest private walks to discuss spiritual matters. Each advance was deflected with gentle courtesy that never quite became rejection, leaving her uncertain whether he was immune to her charms or simply more disciplined than their previous guests. The twins grew increasingly agitated by Ward's presence, their usual coordination disrupted by the constant need to maintain their facade of innocent mill workers. Samuel had taken to sharpening tools with unnecessary vigor whenever Ward was nearby, while Jack found excuses to patrol the perimeter of their property, checking for signs that their guest might be communicating with the outside world. Their paranoia was infectious, spreading through the family like a fever that made every interaction feel dangerous. Sarah noticed that Ward examined their meals with particular attention, complimenting the flavor while studying the texture and appearance of their meat with eyes that seemed far too knowledgeable. She began varying their menu, serving rabbit and venison alongside their usual provisions. But Ward's penetrating gaze suggested he could distinguish between different types of protein in ways that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Willem found himself caught between the desire to eliminate this threat and the recognition that Ward represented a different kind of danger than they'd faced before. Their guest had mentioned specific churches where he was expected, people who would send search parties if he failed to arrive. More troubling still, Ward carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd survived dangerous situations before, someone who understood predators because he'd encountered them in various forms. The breaking point came during Ward's 3rd Sunday at the mill, when he announced his intention to hold a proper service for the family. He'd been conducting informal prayers throughout his stay, but this was different, a formal sermon that he'd clearly been preparing for days. The family gathered in their main room as Ward opened his worn Bible and began speaking about Cain and Abel, about the first murder and the way sin stained the ground where blood was spilled. His voice carried the trained cadence of a man accustomed to holding audiences, but his words seemed directed specifically at them, each sentence crafted to probe their consciences and test their reactions. He spoke of hunger that could never be satisfied, of families torn apart by secrets too terrible to share, of the way evil could take root in the most ordinary places and transform good people into monsters. Willem felt sweat beading on his forehead as Ward's sermon continued, the preacher's eyes moving from face to face as if reading their souls. When Ward began describing the signs that marked a place where innocent blood had been shed, Sarah's hands began trembling so violently that she had to clasp them together to maintain composure. Ruth stopped breathing entirely when Ward mentioned the particular hunger that comes from crossing certain lines, while the twins exchanged glances that carried volumes of unspoken communication. The sermon reached its climax when Ward spoke directly about wolves in sheep's clothing, about predators who used hospitality as a hunting tool, about families who forgot that some kinds of survival came at the cost of their humanity. His voice never rose above its measured tone, never carried accusation or threat, but every word struck the Henley family like physical blows. Willem stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound like a scream. The movement was so sudden and violent that Ward paused mid-sentence, his eyes fixing on Willem's face with unmistakable recognition. In that moment, the careful facade that had protected the family for months crumbled completely, leaving them exposed before a man who clearly understood exactly what they'd become. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, heavy with implications and unspoken threats. Ward closed his Bible with deliberate calm, his expression showing neither fear nor surprise, only a terrible kind of satisfaction. He'd been testing them throughout his stay, probing for confirmation of suspicions that were now proven beyond doubt. The family realized they stood at a crossroads that would determine not just Ward's fate, but their own survival in a world that was rapidly becoming too small to hide their secrets. The morning after Ward's pointed sermon, he announced his intention to leave for the next settlement, claiming urgent business that could no longer be delayed. But as he prepared to saddle his horse, the animal was discovered with a severe limp, unable to bear weight on its front left leg. The injury appeared fresh, as if the horse had stepped wrong during the night, though Ward's eyes suggested he suspected more deliberate causes for his sudden immobility. Willem expressed appropriate concern and regret, insisting that Ward remain as their guest until the horse recovered or suitable transportation could be arranged. The offer was made with perfect frontier hospitality, but the underlying tension was impossible to ignore. Ward accepted with gracious thanks, though his hand never strayed far from the pistol he wore beneath his coat, and his sleep that night was notably restless. Sunday morning arrived with deceptive tranquility, the Nevada mountains bathed in golden sunlight that made their isolation seem peaceful rather than ominous. Ward had announced his intention to hold another service, and the family gathered with expressions of polite anticipation that masked their growing desperation. They understood that this might be their last opportunity to resolve the situation before Ward's continued absence prompted uncomfortable questions from the outside world. Ward opened his Bible to passages about Cain and Abel, about the mark that identified murderers and the way their crimes pursued them across the earth. His voice carried the authority of Scripture, but his eyes never left the faces of his congregation, reading their reactions with the skill of a man who'd learned to recognize guilt in all its forms. He spoke of brothers who spilled innocent blood, of families corrupted by violence, of the way sin spread through bloodlines like a disease that consumed everything it touched. The sermon built inexorably toward its climax, each verse chosen to strip away another layer of the family's carefully maintained facade. When Ward began describing the specific hunger that marked those who'd tasted forbidden fruit, Willem's composure finally shattered completely. He rose from his seat with explosive violence, his chair crashing backward as rage and fear collided in his chest like opposing storms. "Enough!" Willem's voice cracked like thunder in the confined space, silencing Ward mid-sentence and causing his family to recoil in shock. "You sit in our home, eat our food, accept our hospitality, and then dare to judge us? You know nothing about survival, nothing about the choices a man makes to keep his family alive." Ward closed his Bible with deliberate calm, his expression showing neither surprise nor fear at Willem's outburst. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality than before, stripped of clerical gentleness and revealing something harder beneath. I know more about survival than you might think, Willem. I know about the choices men make when civilization falls away, about the lines they cross when hunger becomes stronger than conscience. Sarah gasped as Ward's mask slipped completely, revealing intelligence and experience that had nothing to do with preaching salvation. The twins tensed like coiled springs, hands moving instinctively toward weapons, but Ward continued speaking with unnerving composure. I've seen what you've done here, Willem. The stains in your mill that soap won't remove, the tools that have been adapted for purposes their makers never intended, the way your family looks at strangers like you're calculating portions. You think I haven't noticed the taste of your meat, the texture that no game animal produces. The confession hung in the air between them like a physical presence, transforming their carefully maintained secret into spoken reality. Ruth felt her world shifting as Ward revealed the depth of his knowledge, while Sarah pressed her hands to her mouth, as if she could somehow recall words that had already changed everything. But instead of horror or condemnation, Ward's expression showed something that chilled the family more than anger would have: understanding, acceptance, even a twisted form of admiration for their efficiency and family loyalty. When he spoke again, his words carried implications that none of them had anticipated. You're not the first family I've encountered who've made these choices, Willem. The frontier is full of people who've discovered what they're truly capable of when survival strips away their civilized pretenses. The difference is that most of them work alone, driven by madness or desperation. You've maintained your humanity in every way except the most essential one. Ward rose from his seat with fluid grace, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip but making no threatening moves. I'm not here to judge you, Willem. I'm here because I recognize kindred spirits when I see them. You've built something remarkable here, something that could be even more remarkable with the right guidance and protection. The family stared at him in stunned silence as the full meaning of his words became clear. Ward wasn't their judge or executioner. He was something far more dangerous and tempting. He was offering them legitimacy, partnership, and the promise that their carefully constructed new life could continue and even expand. The predator had revealed himself to be another predator, one who saw opportunity where others would see only horror. Ward's integration into the Henley family operation transformed their crude hunting methods into something approaching military precision. His background, carefully revealed over the following weeks, included service in frontier conflicts where survival often meant abandoning conventional morality. He'd learned to read men's weaknesses, to identify those who wouldn't be missed, and to eliminate threats with efficiency that left no traces for authorities to follow. Under Ward's guidance, the family began actively recruiting victims rather than waiting for chance encounters. He would disappear for days at a time, visiting mining camps and trading posts while posing as a fellow traveler seeking company for dangerous mountain passages. His clerical demeanor inspired trust, and his stories of the generous Henley family, who offered shelter to weary travelers, drew a steady stream of carefully selected prey to their mill. The selection process became an art form under Ward's tutelage. He taught them to identify men fleeing previous crimes, prospectors whose claims had failed and left them desperate, drifters whose disappearance would be attributed to the countless hazards of frontier life. Each potential victim was evaluated for their physical capabilities, their connections to the outside world, and their likelihood of being missed if they vanished without explanation. Ruth flourished under Ward's mentorship, discovering depths to her manipulative abilities that surprised even her family. Ward taught her to read microexpressions, to identify the specific loneliness that made men vulnerable, to craft personas that appealed to different types of masculine weakness. She learned to be a grieving widow for men who needed to feel protective, an adventurous spirit for those seeking excitement, a lost soul for travelers who saw themselves as rescuers. The twins developed their coordination to supernatural levels, anticipating each other's movements with precision that made their hunting partnership devastatingly effective. Ward drilled them in techniques learned from military campaigns, teaching them to control multiple victims simultaneously, to create escape routes and contingency plans, to eliminate evidence with thoroughness that would satisfy the most determined investigation. Sarah evolved from reluctant participant to enthusiastic coordinator, managing their schedule of victims with the efficiency of a businesswoman running a profitable enterprise. She developed elaborate cover stories for their activities, maintained correspondence with distant settlements to establish their reputation as honest mill operators, and created a network of lies so intricate that even she sometimes forgot which parts were fabricated. The mill itself underwent subtle modifications that increased their efficiency while maintaining the appearance of legitimate lumber operations. Ward supervised the construction of hidden restraints, soundproof chambers, and disposal systems that left no evidence of their true activities. Their legitimate business provided perfect cover for the sounds and smells that might otherwise attract unwanted attention from passing travelers. Their confidence grew with each successful hunt, and Ward encouraged them to increase the frequency of their kills as summer progressed into autumn. They developed a rhythm that brought victims to the mill every 2 weeks, carefully spaced to avoid creating patterns that might be noticed by territorial authorities. Each success reinforced their sense of invincibility and their belief that they'd found the perfect hunting ground. The mistake came in October when Ward identified what appeared to be an ideal group of targets. 3 men traveling together toward mining claims in the northern mountains. They carried substantial supplies and enough gold to make them worthwhile prey, but more importantly, they were traveling through territory where disappearances were common enough to avoid triggering intensive searches. Daniel Morrison, James Fletcher, and Robert Hayes were cavalry veterans who'd served together in frontier campaigns before trying their luck as prospectors. Ward's assessment had identified them as typical failed miners seeking new opportunities, but he'd missed crucial details that would prove nearly fatal to the family's operation. The ambush was planned with Ward's usual meticulous attention to detail, but Morrison's military training and survival instincts proved superior to their previous victims. When the attack began, he recognized the coordinated nature of the assault and reacted with tactical awareness that caught the family completely off guard. Fletcher and Hayes died in the initial assault, but Morrison escaped into the forest with intimate knowledge of the family's crimes and the survival skills necessary to evade their pursuit. For the first time since beginning their transformation, the Henley family faced the possibility of exposure, and Ward's confidence was replaced by grim determination to eliminate the threat before it could reach civilization. The hunt that followed would test everything they'd learned about killing, but Morrison represented a different kind of prey than any they'd faced before. He wasn't running towards safety, he was preparing for war, and the family was about to discover that some victims refused to die quietly in the Nevada wilderness. Daniel Morrison moved through the Nevada wilderness with the calculated precision of a man who'd learned survival in Apache territory and refined it during years of frontier cavalry service. The blood from his shoulder wound had clotted hours ago, but the pain served as a constant reminder that the Henley family represented a threat unlike any he'd faced in military campaigns. These weren't enemy soldiers following rules of engagement. They were predators who'd perfected the art of making people disappear. Ward led the family's pursuit with military efficiency, reading Morrison's trail signs and predicting his movements with accuracy born from similar training and experience. But Morrison had advantages that Ward hadn't anticipated. Intimate knowledge of this specific terrain from previous prospecting expeditions, and the desperate fury of a man who'd watched his closest friends butchered like livestock. The chase became a deadly game of move and countermove across the rugged mountain landscape. Morrison would leave false trails to split up his pursuers, then double back to observe their reactions from concealed positions. He'd learned their individual capabilities during the failed ambush, identifying Ward as the tactical leader, the twins as the primary physical threats, and Willem as the weak link whose protective instincts toward his family could be exploited. 3 days into the pursuit, Morrison made his first counterattack, using his knowledge of local geography to lead Samuel into a carefully prepared rockslide that left the younger twin trapped and badly injured. The sound of Samuel's screams echoing across the canyon served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Morrison's willingness and ability to inflict casualties. It forced the family to divert resources to rescue operations, and it shattered their assumption that they were the only hunters in these mountains. Jack's desperate efforts to free his brother revealed the depth of the twins' emotional bond and created the first crack in the family's tactical unity. Ward ordered them to abandon Samuel and continue the pursuit, but Jack refused to leave his injured brother, creating a division in their forces that Morrison exploited with ruthless efficiency. Morrison had discovered their hidden burial ground during his reconnaissance, dozens of unmarked graves that told the complete story of the family's systematic murders over the past year. He began leaving grisly displays constructed from the remains of Fletcher and Hayes, arranged to create maximum psychological impact when the family discovered them. The messages were clear. Morrison understood exactly what they were. He wasn't afraid of them, and he intended to make them pay for every life they'd taken. Ruth became obsessed with Morrison during the hunt, seeing him as the ultimate test of her manipulative abilities and seductive power. She volunteered to track him alone, confident that her beauty and apparent vulnerability would give her advantages that her male relatives lacked. But Morrison's grief over his dead companions had burned away any susceptibility to feminine wiles, and their encounters became increasingly violent as Ruth discovered the limits of her influence. The psychological warfare escalated when Morrison began targeting the family's food supplies and water sources, using his knowledge of wilderness survival to create the same desperation that had originally driven them to cannibalism. He poisoned their well with decomposing animal carcasses, burned their stored provisions, and systematically destroyed the mill equipment they needed to maintain their cover as legitimate operators. Ward's military experience became a liability as Morrison demonstrated superior tactical knowledge and intimate familiarity with the terrain. The family began to understand that they were no longer hunting a victim. They were being hunted by someone who'd learned to think like them but retained enough humanity to be motivated by justice rather than hunger. The tables turned completely when Morrison led them into a canyon where he'd spent 2 days preparing an ambush that used their own hunting techniques against them. Hidden snares and pit traps created a maze of hazards that forced the family to move slowly and carefully, giving Morrison opportunities to pick them off individually while remaining concealed in positions he'd selected for maximum tactical advantage. Samuel's condition deteriorated rapidly without proper medical attention, his fevered delirium making him a liability that endangered the entire family. Jack faced an impossible choice between his brother's survival and the mission's success, while Willem struggled to maintain leadership authority as Ward's strategies proved inadequate against Morrison's superior fieldcraft. The siege mentality that gripped the family during their week-long pursuit of Morrison revealed fractures in their unity that had been hidden beneath their previous successes. Old resentments surfaced under pressure, Individual survival instincts began overriding family loyalty, and their transformation from desperate family to efficient predators started reversing under the stress of being prey themselves. As Morrison's psychological warfare continued, the family realized they faced a choice between retreat and total commitment to a battle they were no longer certain they could win. But their transformation had gone too deep to allow for surrender, and Morrison's knowledge of their crimes made him too dangerous to leave alive. The hunt had become a war of extermination where only one side would survive to see another Nevada sunrise. Morrison's ambush in the canyon caught the family at their most vulnerable moment, when Samuel's deteriorating condition had forced them to move slowly and Jack's divided attention made their coordination sloppy. The rock slide he triggered was perfectly timed to separate the twins from the rest of the family, and the avalanche of stone that followed left Samuel with injuries that even their crude frontier medicine couldn't address. Willem made the agonizing decision to retreat to the mill, where they could access their medical supplies and defensive positions. But Morrison had anticipated this move, and the family discovered that their sanctuary had been transformed into a trap during their absence. Their water well was contaminated with decomposing flesh, their stored meat had been poisoned with wild mushrooms, and their mill machinery was systematically destroyed to eliminate both their income source and their most effective disposal methods. The siege that followed tested every aspect of the family's transformation and unity. Morrison positioned himself in the surrounding forest with clear sight lines to all approaches, making it impossible for them to leave without exposing themselves to his rifle. He'd learned their daily routines during his reconnaissance, and he used this knowledge to disrupt their sleep, their meals, and their ability to care for Samuel's worsening injuries. Sarah experienced the first complete breakdown of her new identity when she found photographs of missing people that Morrison had arranged around their property. The faces of their victims stared back at her from every surface, men whose names she'd forgotten but whose final moments she remembered with horrible clarity. The weight of accumulated guilt crashed over her like a physical force, and she began questioning every choice they'd made since Willem's first hunt the previous winter. The psychological pressure mounted as Morrison began leaving personal items from their victims in places where the family would find them. A wedding ring placed on Sarah's breakfast plate, a photograph of someone's children tucked into Ruth's bedding, a letter from a worried mother found in Willem's toolbox. Each discovery was a calculated reminder of the lives they'd taken and the people who were still waiting for travelers who would never come home. Ward's military experience proved inadequate against Morrison's superior tactics and intimate knowledge of the local terrain. Every strategy Ward proposed was anticipated and countered. Every attempted sortie was met with precision rifle fire that forced them back into the mill. For the first time since joining the family, Ward began showing signs of doubt about their chances of survival, and his uncertainty infected the rest of the group like a spreading disease. Ruth's obsession with Morrison reached dangerous levels as their confinement continued. She volunteered for increasingly reckless reconnaissance missions, convinced that her seductive abilities would eventually overcome his resistance. But Morrison's grief had transformed into cold fury that made him immune to manipulation, and Ruth's attempts to approach him resulted in near-fatal encounters that left her shaken and desperate. The family's unity began fracturing under the constant pressure and Samuel's declining condition. Jack blamed Willem for leading them into this situation, while Willem accused Ward of underestimating their opponent. Sarah questioned whether their survival was worth the cost they'd paid in human lives, and Ruth's growing instability made her a liability rather than an asset in their defensive efforts. Samuel's fever reached critical levels on the 8th day of the siege, his delirious ravings revealing family secrets that Morrison could hear from his concealed positions. The twins' special bond, which had made them such effective hunters, became a weakness as Jack's attention was divided between the external threat and his brother's suffering. When Samuel began calling out the names of their victims in his delirium, the family realized that their cover stories were crumbling along with their defensive position. Morrison's patience proved more formidable than his marksmanship as the siege entered its second week. He'd positioned himself to wait indefinitely, while the family's resources dwindled and their psychological state deteriorated. Their contaminated water supply forced them to rely on melted snow. Their poisoned food stores left them weak from hunger, and their isolation from medical help meant that Samuel's condition continued worsening with each passing day. The breaking point came when Morrison began his final assault, not with direct violence but with a sustained psychological campaign that targeted each family member's individual breaking point. He left evidence of law enforcement interest in missing persons, fabricated correspondence from territorial authorities, and created the impression that their crimes had attracted official attention from sources that couldn't be eliminated through violence. As their situation became desperate beyond any hope of conventional survival, the family faced the choice between surrender and a final, suicidal assault on Morrison's position. But their transformation from ordinary mill operators to efficient predators had gone too deep to allow for surrender, and Morrison's knowledge of their crimes made him too dangerous to leave alive. The siege had become a battle for survival in its most primitive form, where civilization's rules no longer applied and only the most ruthless would live to see another dawn. Dawn on the 10th day of siege brought a blood-red sunrise that seemed to promise violence, and the Henley family prepared for what they all understood would be their final confrontation with Daniel Morrison. Samuel's condition had deteriorated beyond hope of recovery, his fever-racked body consuming what little strength remained in his emaciated frame, but he insisted on participating in the assault that would determine their collective fate. Ward's military experience guided their desperate strategy, using the mill's layout and their intimate knowledge of the surrounding terrain to create multiple approach routes that would force Morrison to divide his attention. The plan required perfect coordination and accepted the probability of casualties, but their situation had become so desperate that even a slim chance of success was preferable to slow starvation and eventual capture. Willem led the primary assault along the eastern approach, using the pre-dawn darkness to close distance before Morrison could bring his rifle to bear effectively. His years of lumber work had given him strength and endurance that served him well in the brutal hand-to-hand combat that erupted when he reached Morrison's concealed position. The two men fought with primitive savagery, each understanding that mercy would mean death for themselves and everyone they sought to protect. Ruth flanked to the north with supernatural silence, her hunting skills refined during months of stalking human prey through these same mountains. But when she finally confronted Morrison near the burial ground where he discovered evidence of their crimes, she experienced a moment of psychological fracture that changed everything. Surrounded by the unmarked graves of their victims, she saw herself clearly for the first time since their transformation began, and the recognition of what she'd become paralyzed her at the crucial moment. The twins coordinated their assault from the western approach, Samuel's deteriorating condition making him reckless in ways that both helped and hindered their attack. His fevered aggression caught Morrison off guard, but his weakness made him a liability that Jack couldn't abandon. When Morrison's rifle fire shattered Samuel's shoulder and sent him crashing into the rocky ground, Jack's tactical discipline dissolved into pure fraternal rage. Morrison's military training served him well in the chaotic multi-front battle, but the family's desperate coordination and intimate knowledge of the terrain gradually wore down his advantages. He'd prepared for a siege, not for the suicidal assault that brought all of them against his position simultaneously. His ammunition began running low as the battle stretched through the morning hours, and his carefully prepared defensive positions were overrun one by one. Ward's role in the battle revealed the true depths of his experience with frontier violence, his movements displaying skills that went far beyond anything a traveling preacher should possess. When Morrison's rifle jammed at a crucial moment, Ward pressed the advantage with tactical precision that trapped their opponent between converging attacks from multiple directions. The final confrontation took place in the canyon where Morrison had first injured Samuel. The site transformed into an arena where civilization's rules no longer applied, and only the most primitive survival instincts mattered. Morrison fought with the desperation of a man who knew that defeat meant not just death, but the continuation of the family's horrific crimes, while the family battled for the right to preserve their transformed way of life. Sarah's participation in the battle came as a shock to everyone, including herself, when she emerged from concealment to strike down Morrison just as he was about to kill her wounded husband. The act completed her transformation from reluctant participant to fully committed member of their predatory family. But the psychological cost was immediate and devastating. When Morrison finally fell, mortally wounded but still conscious, his final words carried a curse that chilled the family more than any threat could have. He promised that their crimes would be discovered, that justice would find them even in these remote mountains, and that the victims they'd killed would not rest until their murders were avenged. The family's victory came at a cost that nearly destroyed them even as it saved their lives. Samuel died from his injuries within hours of Morrison's defeat. His last words a delirious recitation of their victims' names that haunted the survivors long after his body grew cold. Jack's grief transformed into something darker and more dangerous, a rage that sought targets beyond the dead man who'd caused his brother's death. As they disposed of Morrison's body in the same manner they'd used for dozens of previous victims, the family realized that their triumph had fundamentally changed them once again. They'd crossed another line by surviving Morrison's hunt, but the victory felt hollow and poisoned by the knowledge that their secret was too large to remain hidden forever. The Nevada wilderness had witnessed their transformation from desperate family to efficient predators to battle-hardened survivors. But the final test of their new nature was yet to come. Morrison's death had eliminated an immediate threat, but it had also marked them as something beyond human, creatures who would kill anyone and anything that threatened their continued existence in these blood-soaked mountains. 6 months after Morrison's death, the Nevada mountains began yielding their secrets to a new family of settlers who'd heard tales of abandoned mill property available for homesteading. The Carlson family arrived in spring of 1885 with hopes of establishing a lumber operation, drawn by reports of good timber and reliable water sources in the remote canyon where the Henley Mill once operated. They found the mill buildings intact but showing signs of hasty abandonment, with personal belongings scattered as if the previous occupants had fled in the middle of daily activities. Tools remained sharp and well-maintained, the saw blades still mounted and ready for use, but stains that soap wouldn't remove marked the wooden surfaces with patterns that suggested purposes beyond lumber processing. What remained of Daniel Morrison lay buried in an unmarked grave alongside dozens of other travelers who'd sought shelter at the mill during its years of operation. The Carlsons discovered some of these burial sites while clearing land for expansion, but they dismissed the scattered bones as evidence of Indian raids or wild animal attacks, explanations that allowed them to sleep peacefully in beds where the Henley family had once planned their hunts. Morrison had been partially correct in his dying prediction that justice would eventually find the mill, but not in the way he'd imagined. Federal marshals did investigate reports of missing prospectors in the region, but their inquiries led them to empty buildings and cold trails that provided no evidence of systematic murder. The Henley family had vanished as completely as their victims, leaving behind only whispers and speculation. Willem had made the decision to abandon their perfect hunting ground after Morrison's death, recognizing that their secret had grown too large and dangerous to maintain. Ward's connections in distant territories provided them with new identities and safe passage to regions where their reputation hadn't preceded them. But the cost of starting over required abandoning everything they'd built in Nevada. Ruth carried Morrison's final curse with her into their new life, haunted by dreams where their victims rose from unmarked graves to demand justice that would never come. Her transformation from innocent mill daughter to skilled predator was complete and irreversible, but the psychological toll of their Nevada years had left scars that no amount of distance could heal. Jack's grief over Samuel's death had transformed into something colder and more dangerous, a rage that sought expression in increasingly violent ways. Without his twin's moderating influence, his hunting instincts became unpredictable and savage, forcing the family to carefully manage his interactions with potential victims to avoid drawing unwanted attention. Sarah's final transformation during the battle with Morrison had completed her evolution from reluctant participant to enthusiastic coordinator. But the knowledge of what she'd become haunted her with questions about the woman she'd once been. Her memories of their life before the transformation grew dim and uncertain, as if that innocent existence had belonged to someone else entirely. The legend of the Henley Sawmill began spreading through mining camps and frontier settlements within months of their disappearance, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some versions portrayed them as victims of Indian raids, others as casualties of harsh winter conditions, but a few whispered stories suggested darker truths about what had really happened in that remote Nevada canyon. Ward's role in their story became the most distorted in frontier retellings, with some accounts claiming he was a genuine preacher who tried to save the family's souls, while others suggested he'd been a government agent investigating reports of missing travelers. The truth of his partnership with their operation disappeared along with the man himself, leaving only speculation about his true identity and motivations. Modern historians who studied the disappearances in 1884 Nevada attributed them to the harsh realities of frontier life, where people vanished regularly due to accidents, weather, wildlife, and criminal activity. The systematic nature of the murders at the Henley Mill was never recognized, allowing the family's crimes to fade into the larger tapestry of frontier violence that marked America's westward expansion. Archaeological investigations in the late 20th century uncovered evidence of the mill's true purpose, when construction projects in the area revealed mass burial sites that couldn't be explained by conventional frontier hardships. But by then, the Henley family had been dead for decades, their final fates as mysterious as the crimes they'd committed during their transformation from desperate settlers to apex predators. The Nevada mountains preserved their story in ways that human memory could not, with every unmarked grave serving as a monument to ordinary people who discovered the depths of their own capacity for evil. The Sawmill ruins still stand as a testament to what families can become when survival overrides morality, and civilized values prove too fragile to withstand the weight of genuine desperation. But the greatest horror of the Henley family's story isn't what they became during those dark months in 1884. It's how easily any family could make the same choices under similar circumstances. The transformation from victim to predator requires only hunger, isolation, and the terrible discovery that some kinds of meat satisfy appetites that ordinary food cannot touch. In a world where desperation still drives people to impossible choices, the legacy of the Sawmill family serves as a warning about the monsters that live inside us all, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge and feed. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that reveal the hidden darkness lurking in America's past. Tomorrow we'll explore another tale of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary evil within themselves. So hit that notification bell and join us as we continue uncovering the shocking truths that history tried to bury. What secrets are hiding in your own family's past? You might be surprised by what you'd find if you looked deep enough.